In this last video for this week's topic on labour, we're going to be thinking about the question, how do descendants remember Gimit today? Recently in Fiji, a national celebration known as Gimit Day was instituted, and once a year, many people throughout Fiji spend this day remembering the legacy of the labour trade. Remembering this legacy has been aided by archival documents, particularly historical photographs like the one I'm sharing here, reproduced courtesy of the Fiji Museum. The National Archives of Fiji and the Fiji Museum are one of a couple of institutions within Fiji that form a broader colonial archive that documented this system. Although we need to treat these images carefully, remembering that the majority of people that had access to photographs and actually took these images were usually associated with the colonial system themselves. They were often CSR officials or company men or government officials who were documenting the labour trade. And so it's no surprise that many of the images they left behind don't highlight the abuses or the mistreatment that people underwent through the system. However, there are also others, including travellers and missionaries, who were more interested in the lives of these labourers and how they interacted and integrated with their Fijian neighbours. And that's why I'm starting this lecture with this particular image. It shows both Indians and Fijians living side by side near Rarawai Mill, which is in Ba. And you'll see if you travel around Fiji, there are many places, particularly around these centres of sugar production, where Indigenous Fijians and Indo-Fijians have been coexisting for many years. And they speak each other's languages, many have intermarried and produced offspring, and so they've mixed together quite seamlessly. And in some cases it's quite hard to distinguish these two communities today. So how might people remember this particular period of time? We have to remember as historians to be careful not to be anachronistic. That is, judging people and events of the past according to the assumptions or the ideas of the present. But let's think about two different ways in which the experience of Gimit is remembered today. One is overwhelmingly focusing on the tragic nature of the system and the horrendous abuses that occurred, including imprisonment, kidnapping, mental, physical and verbal abuse, cases of criminal misconduct, sexual misconduct, which contributed to high rates of death and suicide. At the time, in 1913, an event which became known as Kunti's Cry speaks to this tragedy. Kunti was a Gamitia woman who tried to escape an overseer who was attempting to rape her, and in doing so tried to throw herself into the Rewa River to escape, even though she couldn't swim. Although her experience may have been shared by other Gamitia men and women across plantations in Fiji, her particular story was reported across Fiji national newspapers, and it also gained international attention both in India and in England as an example of the inhumane nature of the system. It was supported by other publications, including an important book, My 21 Years in the Fiji Islands, by Totaram Sanadja, who was actually a Gamitia, a indentured labourer in Fiji, and who went back to India to publish his experiences, most of which were overwhelmingly tragic. His narrative contrasts with that of Walter Gill, an Australian representative of the colonial sugar refinery, who was based as an overseer in Fiji, and who published an autobiography in 1970 called Turn Northeast at the Tombstone. Although he tried to justify his position as an overseer, some of the quite graphic details that he gives, publishing quite late after the fact in 1970, also support some of the things that Totaram and Kunti had raised. That of mistreatment, inequality, and inhumane conditions for labourers. Although we might remember the tragic circumstances of the Gilmit experience, there is also another sort of remembering at play today, and that one focuses on the more positive aspects of this experience and values of strength, resilience, and hope. The wreck of the Syria is a famous case in 1884, when a ship carrying Indian indentured labourers wrecked off the coast of the Rewa River. That boat, named the Syria, carried a number of Indian indentured labourers who drowned in the middle of the night because they could not swim. However, there were nearby Fijian communities who paddled out in canoes to rescue the survivors, and those survivors and their descendants would later be adopted within that Fijian community. More recently, in the 2000s, the descendants of those people wrecked in that particular instance were formally adopted as part of the Vanua by the High Chief of Rewa Rokotuidraketi, Rotimumukepa. The first instance in the history of Fiji where a foreign population, or Kaivalangis, were formally adopted within the Vanua. And it's a wonderful example of that connection between Indo-Fijians and indigenous Fijians. Although Gomitias had some horrendous experiences in Fiji, they also banded together to form distinct communities that preserved cultural practices and traditions and celebrated their lives together. As a result, we have some historical buildings left behind that were constructed by these men and women. If you travel in Suva, you'll see the Sikh temple up near Samambula, and that was actually one of the oldest religious buildings constructed by the Gomitias in the 1920s. But there are many others scattered around Fiji. Temples were a wonderful place where Indo-Fijians could gather together and celebrate their own languages and practices, which they were not permitted to do on the plantations. We also see at the family level, families preserving photographs, memorabilia, and particular items such as moha, the gold jewelry, or moha refers to gold coins, which were kept as a form of wealth and preserved within the family. But there are other forms of jewelry and heirlooms that were kept within families that connected them back to their time in India. There's also been interesting research on the preservation of particular practices and traditions. And one of my former students, Afshana Anzeg of the USP, has a fascinating MA thesis in the library about how cooking traditions have been preserved by Jahajian or Gomitia women. So I propose to you, if you are in Fiji next year, to think about how people remember this experience of Gilmit. You might also apply that to how you might remember the Melanesian labour trade. Although there is no national holiday celebrating that particular system, they share many similar experiences with Indo-Fijians and can remember both the tragic circumstances in which people were used as labourers, but also the ways in which indigenous Melanesians and Polynesians were integrated within Fijian society. That's the end of this rather short video, but I wanted to point out some wonderful online resources for those that are interested in this topic further. Of course, we have many Indo-Fijian students at USP, and there is a rich body of knowledge that they can draw on to trace family histories and the histories of this indentured labour trade. There are online websites like geomit.org and the Virtual Fiji Museum website, which contain fragments of the past. But we also have some rather comprehensive historical literature, first written by Ken Gillian and Bridge V. Lal. Bridge V. Lal is one of Fiji's most celebrated and prolific authors, the descendant of a Gomitia family from Lambasa. He was a graduate of USP and went on to produce countless articles and books about the Gimit experience. And many of them are free online today. So I highly recommend reading Bridge Lal, and you'll see in our readings this week we look at Gillian and Lal. Since Gillian and Lal, there have been some interesting offshoots and new research. Of course, there are some business histories and colonial histories of the colonial sugar refinery, but what I'm particularly interested in is the Indo-Fijian studies that have emerged by people like Shaisa Shamim, who did her thesis at the University of Waikato, by Professor Sudesh Mishra, who is a literature professor but wrote about the Leonidas, and by Dr. Margaret Mishra, who currently teaches at USP and has focused on feminist histories of the Gimit experience. And I think these are interesting not only for Fiji history, but within the broader scope of South Asian studies, which have been connecting the experiences of Gimitias in India and Fiji with the experiences in other colonial territories such as the Caribbean and South Africa. So there really is a lot there to look at, but we're just going to touch on a little bit in our tutorial. If you're finding some of these readings quite challenging, then I've put up some links to videos on the Moodle page. One of them is a fascinating documentary produced in 2012 by Satish Rai titled In Exile at Home. And the other is an interview with Professor Bridge Lal, who no longer is with us. He passed away a couple of years ago now. But it's wonderful to hear in his own words what his research was about and why he was motivated to write about the Indian indentured experience. So if you don't have time to look at those two readings, I strongly encourage you to watch the YouTube videos instead before our next class. And I've posted them up on the Moodle page. Even if you're not Indo-Fijian, there are many interesting topics that we can discuss in our class next week. Perhaps before we have that class, you might ask your friends and family, how do they remember Gimit? What are the different Indian groups that exist within Fiji? What different religions, languages, regions, classes or castes are there? And what happened to the caste system when Gomitias came to Fiji? We will discuss this at length in our next class. Thank you.